Good evening, everybody. It's 8 o'clock, and welcome to today's episode of Marvelous Medicine. Dr. Richard Silbert, Senior Associate Consultant, Division of General Internal Medicine, Department of Internal Medicine, Mayo Clinic, Rochester, and Assistant Professor of Medicine, Mayo Clinic, College of Medicine and Science, will be delivering the lecture on environmental effects on human health. Dr. Silbert did his bachelor's and master's in neuroscience from Tulane University, New Orleans, and his medical training from University of Illinois College of Medicine at Chicago. He then went on to do his residency in internal medicine from Mayo Clinic School of Graduate Medical Education. Dr. Silbert has special interests are quality, teaching, and mentoring. He's a green advocate and has received Alpha Omega Alpha Honor, Mayo International Health Program Travel Award, and the COVID Frontline Care Team Award. Delivered several lectures on a wide range of topics in different parts of the United States, and we look forward to listening to you today. Welcome, Dr. Richard Silbert, and thank you so much for accepting to be part of Marvelous Medicine.
Thank you, Dr. Mohanram. So I appreciate you guys having me here today. This is a topic that I'm quite passionate about, right? And it's really important to be able to share this message. So let me share my screen here.
Moderating the session will be Dr.
Perfect. So
we're going to talk a little bit. Rick, just give me a minute. Moderating the session will be Dr. Y. Srinivas Verma. He's the Managing Director of Yellamachilli Healthcare Services Private Limited. He's a medical consultant to the National Institute of Ocean Technology and other corporate organizations, and is an adjunct faculty and research supervisor at the Indian Maritime University, Chennai. Dr. Srinivas Verma did his MBBS from Stanley Medical College, MBA in Healthcare Management from Anna University, and PhD in Management from Madras University. He's a general medical practitioner and researcher. His research interests include stochastic modeling and predictive analytics in healthcare, health risk stratification, non-communicable diseases, maritime occupational health and safety. The research collaborated at Vistas Chennai and has published research articles on health risk determinants, healthcare management, and interdisciplinary areas. Thank you, Dr. Srinivas Verma, for agreeing to moderate this session. Over to you, Rick.
Okay, thank you guys. Appreciate it. So we're going to be talking about sustainability in medicine, right? And that's going to be 4 major things I'd want you to take away from this talk are sort of what are the health impacts of a changing climate? How does healthcare contribute to climate change? What is being done on an international and a national level in the United States to reduce the environmental impact of healthcare? And then what's being done at our institution here at Mayo? So first is climate change and health. And if possible, I'd love it if anybody's able to put in the chat or sort of talk about some of these pictures we're going to see in a second, right? And so the way I think about climate change and health is there's the major climate events, which we hear a lot about in the news, and then there's the everyday health impact. So first, talking about major climate events, there was a number of big events in 2022. And so if anybody's able to sort of tell me what this is a picture of, any guesses? I think, Pata, you're saying it might be hard to do audience participation here. So I'll give you some of these. So this is actually a bridge to an island in Florida that was destroyed during Hurricane Ian over the fall in 2022. And so Hurricane Ian had a very high death toll, is much higher than actually this number. And part of it was that it was a severe storm and it was hitting major population centers in Florida. So when we talk about the health impacts of major hurricanes, right, there's the physical injuries that can come from the storm itself. But as you guys know, right, these flooding events and water damage can cause longstanding mold in buildings that can persist for a long period of time, and that can contribute to respiratory illnesses. We also need to think about the psychological trauma of losing kind of your livelihood, your belongings, your way of life, right? And I used to live in New Orleans, and they've done studies that even years after Hurricane Katrina, there was an increased rate of psychological disease that persisted long after the event itself. The other thing to think about is you can see in this picture, right, you know, the major infrastructure is impacted, right? And the functioning of daily life is impacted, but yet people still need access to dialysis, chemotherapy, urgent care, pharmacies, right? And the inability to access those healthcare resources can cause its own morbidity and mortality. The next sort of one I wanted to talk about here is major flooding, and I'll give this to you rather than soliciting guesses. This is the flooding that occurred in Pakistan over the summer. So the death toll from the flooding in Pakistan neared 1,500. There was estimates that about 12% of the country was underwater, and it really impacted many different aspects of health, right? So there was physical trauma from this. We know that flooding also increases the rate of waterborne diseases due to contamination of clean drinking water. It can also impact the prevalence of mosquito-borne diseases. So in one province that was affected in Pakistan, the rate of dengue and the immediate aftermath of this flooding was about 3,800 cases and about 10 to 20 extra deaths in the immediate aftermath. We also know that this can affect agriculture and can lead to malnutrition in areas that already have levels of food insecurity. And then there's psychological trauma. And again, like we talked about with hurricanes, there's difficulty with healthcare access. This next picture is actually a picture of Amsterdam. So in Amsterdam, there's complex waterways, and they use these bridges that have metal locks, right? And so during the heat wave that occurred over the summer in Europe, the heat was high enough that it was actually expanding the metal, and they had to hose down the streets in order to prevent buckling and to preserve the proper functioning of these bridges and critical infrastructure. So, you know, one of the things that I hadn't realized was that Europe is the fastest warming region on the planet, right? And so this heat wave that occurred over the summer was responsible for over 15,000 excess deaths compared to a normal year. And a lot of that occurred in wealthy countries such as United Kingdom, Spain, Germany, Portugal. When we think of the the health impacts of heat waves, right? We think about heat stroke. We think about increased cardiovascular and cerebrovascular disease that occurs as the body is adapting to the higher heats. We also know that heat waves increase the level of air pollutants and increase the susceptibility for wildfires. We know that that greatly increases the air pollutant burden, and that can be a major precipitant of respiratory illnesses. Interestingly, taking all those three sort of categories we talked about, there's an increased level of hospital admissions that's not fully accounted for by the other three causes, right? So increased heat leads to more demand for healthcare in ways that we don't fully understand. So just to go a little bit into pathophysiology, right? When we think of extreme heat, that causes an increase in autonomic nervous system tone, and that'll cause increased cutaneous dilation in order to cool ourselves off, which in turn decreases visceral blood flow and increases cardiac output, right? So if we increase cardiac output, we're increasing heart rate and we're increasing contractility. These changes for a healthy younger person, right? We are capable of making those hemodynamic changes and adapting to an extent, right? There's always a level of heat change that the body cannot fully adapt to, but most people are able to do this. However, if you have pre-existing cardiovascular disease, making these compensatory changes is harder and puts you at greater risk. So We've gone through some of these major events from the past year, but the bigger question is, we hear all these headlines, but are natural disasters occurring more frequently, right? And in the US, there's this kind of entrenched camp of people that think that, you know, these things have always been happening, right? This is no different. It's just more publicity for them. But the truth is, actually, these events have been increasing in terms of number, right? And so you can kind of see in this chart from the 1980s to 2000, the average number of events was in the range of 3 to 8, right, for most of these years. And the cost of these events was not substantially high, right? So high in a relative term, right? This is just in the US, but over the past 10 to 15 years, the number of events has increased drastically. So some of the most, the highest event years have been in the past 10 years. And the cost of these events is going up as we have more that's at risk from these severe storms. So you can kind of see a lot of this increase is due to the increase in severe storms, but there's also increases in tropical cyclones. Even winter storms continue to be prevalent and cause damage even as the climate warms. We take that on the next chart, just looking at severe storm count, you can see how these events have changed over time. So to reiterate, costlier climate events are becoming more frequent, and the US averaged 7.7 of these billion-dollar disasters per year over the past 40 years, going back to 1980. However, over the last 5 years, the average of these billion-dollar events has increased to 18 per year. If we look at the impact globally, it's thought that over the past 50 years, the estimated mortality from these major climate events is close to 2 million people at a cost of nearly 4 trillion. The good news is that even though we're having more of these events, the mortality from each of these events is decreasing. And that's because there's increased weather forecasting. There's increased use of early warning systems that allow populations to adapt and have more emergency resources available. And also there's been an improvement in building codes, right? So, you know, it's less likely that there's catastrophic failures of residential or commercial infrastructure that can really increase mortality. So we talked a little bit about major climate events, right? But there's also a major impact on health from the everyday impact of a changing climate. So if we look kind of at the factors that are going on here, we know that increasing CO2 levels lead to rising temperatures, which increases extreme weather and causes a rising in sea levels. And looking at a few parts of this, we talked about how extreme heat can increase the rate of heat-related illness and death and cardiovascular disease. We also know air pollution and allergens increase cardiovascular disease, asthma, and respiratory allergies. We talked a little bit earlier about how there's changes in vector ecology, right? So things like malaria, dengue, Lyme disease, West Nile virus, they impact a greater area and for a longer season. It's also important to remember that climate change can impact our food supply, which can increase our rates of malnutrition, and can impact our water supply, which increases the rates of diarrheal disease. In the United States, that might not be the thing that's foremost on our mind, but is a bigger issue in countries that have a lower overall income. So I'll go over these slides quickly of things that we think about in our region where Mayo is, right? And that region in the United States is actually projected to have the highest increase in heat-related deaths. And a lot of that is due to exposure to workers that are not able to get significant shelter, and the fact that a lot of our region is in a rural area where it's harder to get access to healthcare. So I think these lessons are ones that can transmit to any area globally that has a lot of the same factors. Thankfully, today accepted because it's snowing like crazy, if I could show you my window outside, but there is a decreased cold-related morbidity and mortality that's associated with this changing climate, but it doesn't offset the increase of morbidity and mortality from increased hot weather events. We also know that in our region, the increase in particulate matter in ozone is projected to increase annual deaths by 200 to 550 by the year 2050. In our region, we have a large number of rivers with large floodplains, which makes us prone to flooding, and drinking water contamination also leads to displacement with the psychological trauma that we discussed that can come from that before. In terms of vector-borne diseases, we have a disease called Lyme disease that previously had been mostly limited to the northeastern part of the country. But now if you look at it, the exposed area in the United States is basically most of the northern and central and northeastern swaths. And the season where people are at risk is getting longer and longer each year. And that's both for Lyme disease and for West Nile virus. They have also shown that because of warming climate, there's actually higher infection rates because these vectors have a more habitable environment for a longer period of time. We talked a little bit about water-related illnesses in terms of major precipitation events can sully sources of clean water and increase sort of GI pathogen exposure. We also know that that can overwhelm sewer systems. So in the United States, most of our sewer systems are between 50 and 100 years old and have not been updated, and they're easily overwhelmed by these major precipitation events. The other thing is that large areas of stagnant water can cause algae blooms, which can cause multiple organ damage. We talked a little bit about mental health and sort of the toll of these flooding and droughts that can sort of, you know, especially in our region, we have a lot of farmers, right? So they're dealing with areas or times of drought which can impact their crops, and then episodes of flooding, right, that can ruin an entire crop. So just to summarize, right, we have this rise in atmospheric greenhouse gases that creates both a rise in temperature and a change in precipitation, which is drastically increasing multiple different determinants of health. So we talked about the health impact of climate change, but it's also important to look at the role of healthcare in creating climate change. So healthcare is both the solution and the problem. And the reason that I say that is greenhouse gas emissions, like we discussed, increase the healthcare burden that we are going to be responsible for taking care of. However, in healthcare, we are responsible for a large amount of the emissions that are fueling this process. So looking at healthcare globally, it contributes to about 4 to 5% of global emissions, which is equivalent to the 5th largest emitting country, or 514 coal-fired power plants. The top healthcare emitters are kind of no surprise, right? It's the United States, the European Union, and China that comprise 56% of all global healthcare emissions. Also no surprise, given we like to do everything bigger and more drastically, the US is the biggest per capita emitter. And for this talk, right, we emit 57 times more per capita than you guys do in India, and 7 times more than they do in China. In the United States, healthcare is an even bigger percentage of our emissions at 8.5%. The biggest thing, and I think the thing that we really have to spend the next few years working on, is how do we quantify the emissions that come from healthcare? And so there's this standardized accounting system that looks at 3 different scopes for emissions. So the first scope is direct emissions. So this is the emissions that come from the tailpipe emissions of vehicles that, you know, healthcare uses, or that come from our facilities, or that leak out of our pipes, or that come from anesthesia inhalers, that sort of thing. Scope 2 emissions are the emissions that are caused as a result of energy, heat, and cooling that we use in our facilities, right? So this would be if we're purchasing electricity for our buildings, if that's coming from a coal-fired power plant, that would be part of the Scope 2 emissions. Scope 3 is sort of the biggest category and has the most things under it. So I like to think of that as all the emissions that come from upstream production of goods and services used in healthcare, as well as downstream downstream waste that comes as a result of things that we are making or giving to patients. So this would include sort of the emissions that employees require to commute to work, right? The emissions of business travel, transportation and distribution, waste, the fuel and energy uses of the producers that are supplying us goods. And those are the upstream. The downstream also includes transportation, distribution, how the products we use are sold and disposed of. And so if we look at emissions in healthcare, scope 1, which again is the direct emissions from our facility, is about 17% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Scope 2, which is the emissions of the power and electricity we use, is about 12%. And then the greatest bucket here is scope 3, which is the downstream and upstream sources of emissions. So if we break this down more, you can sort of see, if we look at scope 2, the emissions due to our electricity, gas, heating, and cooling, that's 12%, but it's 40% of scope 3 emissions. So that's how much energy our producers and suppliers are using. Other big ones here, right, are agriculture, manufacturing, transport. And you can sort of see that transport is another big part of scope 1 emissions, or the emissions directly attributable to healthcare organizations themselves. So the other interesting fact that I learned about while doing the slides for this presentation is healthcare has a few unique sources of greenhouse gas emissions, and that is anesthetic gases and metered dose inhalers. And we'll talk about those a little bit more later. But just to reiterate, the majority of overall emissions come from upstream and downstream sources, and those have been the hardest for us in healthcare to really quantify how much of it we're using, right? What's going into the products that are being sent to us in terms of production, packaging, transport, and how are we disposing of them, and what impact does that have? Healthcare has some unique difficulties in that regard, in terms of there's a lot of heavy reliance on single-use products for both sterility and patient safety, right? But you could argue there's a lot of room to improve. So an interesting one is anesthetic gases, right? So there's two major categories here that are potent greenhouse gases, and that's fluorinated gases, the fluorines, and nitric oxide. So each of these is over 100 times more potent than carbon. I think desflurane is 1,700 times more potent than carbon for an equal weight. And the really harmful thing here is that these compounds have a half-life in the atmosphere of years, right? And so in anesthesia, the use of fluorines is increasing, and it's becoming a bigger and bigger percentage of healthcare's emissions. And when they've done research on this, it's really trying to balance out the environmental impact of fluorines and nitric oxide versus the clinical indication and the occupational risk of those who are performing these procedures, right? And so there's thought that inhaled anesthetics might be better for cardiothoracic surgery, renal surgery, but there may be a role of using intravenous anesthesia like propofol in cancer surgeries and pediatric surgeries. There's also a movement to say, hey, do we really need to use nitric oxide? That's one of the older anesthetics that we don't use as often. And maybe there are better options available. And of the fluorines, right, there are certain fluorines such as desflurane that are much more polluting than sevoflurane and other medications in that same class. So can we use intravenous anesthesia? Can we use xenon? That's a big area that there's a lot of potential for healthcare to decrease its particularly bad release of pollutants. The other part is inhalers, and I was also surprised by this. So there had been a previous move to get rid of propellants in inhalers that were bad for the ozone layer, right? And so in the United States, 10, 15, 20 years ago, they switched over to different models for the propellants. However, they still use hydrofluorocarbon propellants. And these propellants are 1,500 to 3,600 times more potent than CO2 for trapping heat in the atmosphere. So in the US, the use of these inhalers alone is equivalent to 500,000 cars per year. There are alternatives like dry powder inhalers that are a good substitute, and most patients that are able to have good inspiratory effort are good candidates for using dry powder inhalers. So it's something that we can think about more in terms of, are there better alternatives that we can prescribe? I'd say the interesting, there's a New York Times article. If you look at inhalers and climate change, New York Times, it's a really interesting article of sort of the saga that has been there in terms of inhaler changes over time. So just to reiterate, emissions in healthcare, they've been increasing, right? And so the most recent data I could find is that the emissions in healthcare alone have increased 30% from 2003 to 2013. And it accounted for almost 400,000 disability adjusted life years in 2018 alone. And we also know that healthcare, like we were talking about, is with the anesthetic gases, is responsible for significant percentages of certain types of pollution. So acidification, smog formation, and then respiratory diseases from particulate matter. We also know with a warming climate, the risk of regional drought has really increased, and hospitals are a big source of commercial water use. So in the United States, it's 7% of commercial water use, which may not sound that high, but we think of how much water goes into industrial and agricultural processes. That's actually a very large percentage given its footprint. So we talked about the health impacts of climate change. We talked about how healthcare impacts climate change. Now it's sort of a time to talk about what is being done to reduce the impact of healthcare. So on a global level, there's the annual United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP. And COP26, which was in 2021, was the first of these conferences that really focused on healthcare, both the health impact of climate change, but also how healthcare organizations were contributing. During that conference, 60 countries, including the United States, committed to low carbon health systems, with 20 countries saying that they were going to try to achieve net zero carbon status by 2050. There was recently COP27 in Egypt, and that was, I think, October and November. And where there wasn't these sort of big same pledges, there's now a whole section of the conference that's really geared towards different issues that come up with health and climate change. We also know that a lot of countries are increasing their health adaptation planning. So 86 countries now have health systems that coordinate with their respective weather services to forecast these extreme events and have extra resources and capacity available when these events are expected, which can decrease some of the impact in terms of morbidity and mortality. We also know that 51 countries have plans for how their national health systems are going to adapt to a changing climate. Another big thing is fossil fuel divestment. So divestment is something that's happened on a much larger scale in terms of overall investment funds. I think it's over 1 trillion from overall investment funds that have been divested from fossil fuels. If we look at just health institution assets, 42 billion has been divested from 2008 to 2019. And a lot of this is coming in terms of the environmentally sustainable grading, that, or ESG, where more investment firms are looking at the sustainability impacts of their investment as one of the things that they weigh, in addition to financial return and growth prospects. We also know that health and climate research is increasing, which is incredibly important because that's how we understand the scope of the problem and different ways that we can fix some of these issues. So I wanted to highlight a country that's done a pretty good job on its overall greenhouse gas emission footprint, and that's the United Kingdom. So they were the first country to commit to a net zero emissions. This is the National Health Service there. And they looked at their emissions from 1990 until now, and they called for evidence-based policies and and it really took an accounting of the different sources of emissions for them to really say, like, hey, this is how we're going to decrease our emissions in these different categories. and modeled what would be like to do nothing versus making some of these evidence-based policies, putting them into action. So some of the things they did, the UK was actually the first to use zero emission vehicles, including ambulances in their fleets. And so it's not all ambulances in the country, but a growing proportion are electric ambulances, which is a lot harder to engineer than a regular electric car, right? Because there's a lot of power demand and heating and cooling demands in an ambulance that are more energy intensive than your typical vehicle. They've also made it so that all new hospitals and clinics in the United Kingdom have to be built with a net zero carbon standard. They've also done a good job of replacing fluorescent lighting with LED lighting and requiring their purchasing process to at least consider emissions, right? There's not a hard stop in terms of they must buy from certain sources, but it is a more important variable in terms of how they produce things. The other thing that the UK system has been doing is looking at waste streams and how to reduce them, and then importantly, avoiding unnecessary visits. And I think that's an important thing to consider, and especially here in Rochester, we have a lot of people who come from all over the country, all over the world for visits. And if we make them make repeat visits, or if we make them come in and don't have a very consolidated itinerary, we potentially cause that much more in terms of emission with unnecessary travel and unnecessary sort of use of facilities that we know contributes to the emissions from our buildings. So to look at what's being done in the United States, right? So under our main umbrella of the Health and Human Services, we have the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, or AHRQ. And they have put out that it's crucial to track and understand sources of emissions, right? We can't really fix the problem if we don't know what it is. And they outlined key strategies for different types of emissions and set a high-level aim of decreasing healthcare's emissions by 50% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. So that's pretty similar to what was talked about at COP26. And AHRQ recommended we get to that goal by first focusing on hospitals and large healthcare systems because they have a disproportionate impact. And you can sort of see that here. Hospital care accounts for 35% of overall emissions. Prescription drugs counts for 12%. And then we see a lot of other categories are smaller. So the AHRQ laid out some different recommendations. I won't go through all of these, but they recommended a bigger focus on renewable energy and zero carbon fuel sources to help lower scope 2 emissions. So the energy that goes, or the emissions that go into the energy that we use in healthcare. They also recommended careful attention to anesthetic choices, like we were talking about with the fluorines and nitric oxide, as well as lower carbon alternatives for inhalers. And they really said that it's about analyzing the supply chain and seeing what sources of emissions are for producers that are giving us the goods and services that we use, right? And we can't really know how big of an impact those upstream producers are having unless we start asking and having them do an accounting, right, of the emissions that are produced. I think the last little point here, right, is we know that plant-based protein uses a lot less in terms of emissions than animal-based protein. So they recommended having plant-forward menus and retail options. I think earlier it was about 9% of the scope 3 emissions in healthcare comes from emissions related to agriculture. So we talked about AHRQ, that's within Health and Human Services. The President Biden's administration over the past year also called to decrease healthcare emissions by 50% by 2030. 61 hospitals and health sector organizations joined. That was of June of last year. Interestingly, Mayo was not one of them. We'll come back to that in a little bit. And there's been a lot in terms of large pharma companies such as AstraZeneca and Pfizer pledging to get to net zero emissions before the 2050 deadline. The United States has the system of veterans hospitals, and they've been trying to incorporate climate resiliency and sustainability into all of their construction and transition to zero emission vehicles, similar to the UK health system. I wanted to highlight a few of the other big organizations here, and I highlight them because Mayo often likes to compare ourselves to no one, but if we were, it would be to the Kaisers and the Cleveland Clinics that we have here in this country. So Kaiser Permanente is a large hospital system in the American West, which is a drought-prone area. And they actually have claimed carbon neutrality back in 2020 through the production of clean energy and purchasing carbon offsets. Carbon offsets are a somewhat divisive topic in terms of if you help plant a forest somewhere, does that negate the carbon that you produce from your buildings? That's a whole other talk. I won't get into it. But importantly, when Kaiser is talking about carbon neutrality, it's only in their scope 1 and 2 emissions. And as we talked about, that only accounts for about 29% of total emissions related to healthcare. I still think this is a major achievement that they've done. And the way that they've done it is increasing how many facilities they have that have solar power. And in the American West, there's a lot of sunshine, there's less rain. And so what they've done is they've often paired these solar panels with renewable microgrids with battery storage so that they can use electricity generated from these even when the sun isn't shining, and sort of smooth out the peak demand and energy requests that they have from their institutions, which drastically lowers costs. They've also decreased anesthetic gas emissions by 23%. And especially important for the American West, where drought is a big concern, they've decreased their water use per square foot by 13% over the past 10 years. Another competitor is Cleveland Clinic. So their goal is to have carbon neutrality in scope 1 and 2 by 2027. In the United States, we have a certification called LEED, which is for an environmentally sustainable and green building architectural style. And they've required that for all new construction since 2007. They've also tried to reduce energy usage per square foot by 25% since 2010. And they're working on reducing the amount of hazardous waste that they, or non-hazardous waste that they give to landfills. Importantly, and we talked about how big of a contribution this is to emissions, they've required their vendors to provide environmental metrics on products, and that helps them make decisions that lower their scope 3 emissions. So the last thing I want to talk about before we open up for questions is what's being done at Mayo. And so at Mayo, we had a news item over the summer that said that we joined this Better Climate Challenge. And this challenge encourages organizations to cut their emissions by 50% within 10 years, right? And so we saw that Kaiser and Cleveland Clinic had much more ambitious goals. If you even looked at sort of the United States goal, is to have 50% reduction by 2030, which is less than 10 years from now, and then net zero by 2050. And even though they joined this Better Climate Challenge, right, it doesn't mandate that they reduce their emissions by that amount. It just encourages them. So it wasn't quite the level of solid pledge that I think many of us here were hoping for. However, Mayo Clinic has made a lot of important strides in decreasing energy usage and emissions. So from 2010 to 2020, Mayo Clinic Rochester, which is our flagship campus, reduced its energy use by 20%, and the goal is to get that to 30% by 2025. That's been a little bit hard in the pandemic, given that there's been a lot of changes in energy usage times and occupancy schedules. So it's been a little harder to hold to that goal, but that's what we're still shooting for. We had a lot of fluorescent and conventional light bulbs on campus, and those have almost completely been changed to LED. In our campus, which really has extreme heat, whether it's extreme heat and cold events through the year, sealing air ducts leads to incredible increases in efficiency. And we've also tried to retro commission buildings to make them more energy efficient. The thing that I'm pretty passionate about and I've been working about is adjusting heating and cooling based on occupancy schedules. So the energy related to heating and cooling is our #1 use of energy. And so making sure that when there are not people in the buildings, we are not trying to make it as comfortable as it would need to be, as if a full workforce was present. Solar at Mayo, this is another thing I'm passionate about. We have this building here in the top right that's called the Damon parking ramp, and it has all these solar arrays on it. And it looks quite impressive because it's right next to the main buildings where most patients are, and it's the parking structure for patients, right? But unfortunately, there's no other solar anywhere else on the Rochester campus. It's like they put this in just the most visible area, right? Without necessarily thinking about, putting it in all the different areas that Mayo owns in this city, which is actually quite a lot of real estate. There is a thought of using solar carports, right? So this is putting solar panels above parking spaces, and that takes land which would be sort of heat trapping, right, with black concrete, and instead puts that towards power generation, and also allows cars to be protected from the elements. So less air conditioning use when people get into their cars, less heating use when people get into their cars. They put these in our Florida campus, but interestingly, it was a building that we leased from another company. And the other company did it as part of their net zero goals, but Mayo was resistant because of cost constraints. And so the other company did this independently, and Mayo hasn't done it on their own, which is unfortunate. The third of our campuses, our large campuses in Arizona, which, like we were talking about with the American Southwest before, has an incredible amount of sunshine and is prime area for solar. However, there's been issues with setting up solar there due to costs and incentive structure of how electricity is purchased. But the hope is that in the coming years, things like solar carports and having microgrids like they did at Kaiser could be a solution that allows it to pay for itself, and hopefully in a 10-year time frame. Mayo has also done more in terms of sourcing energy from community solar gardens. So that might not be solar arrays that Mayo owns itself, but could be in communities and purchasing from there. Just going back to this Damon parking ramp, so you see all those solar panels, the total generation from that is about 134 kilowatts. And so that's about the size of 20 residential solar units, because the typical one is about 7 kilowatts. So it's not a huge amount, and there's a lot of potential for growth. One of the things Mayo does really well is recycling, right? So the stat kind of boggled my mind, but across our facilities, we generate 40,000 pounds of waste daily, which is a staggering amount. But there are some pretty advanced processes for diverting as much of that from a waste stream as possible. So a lot of paper products are shredded and given to a paper mill that's in the neighboring state. Rigid plastics are broken down and reused in secondary products like bedpans and other rigid plastic construction. Styrofoam, they form into these logs you can see here, and then they sell it to a vendor who makes it into different things like coolers and bicycle helmets. Food waste is given to local hog farmers, and then Mayo disposes of radioactive waste internally, which is kind of a cool process to learn about. The stuff that doesn't make it through any of these recycling processes is actually incinerated to generate heat and electricity, and there are scrubbers to reduce the harmful emissions that come from incineration. So a few other points on sustainability at Mayo. They have a purchasing cooperative. The goal is to increase sustainability in product sourcing. They quote that 40% of products have at least one positive environmental attribute. However, unfortunately, that does not mean that that attribute is related to decreased greenhouse gas emission. That could be how it's disposed of. That could be in terms of how reusable it is, right? Those are important things, but we haven't gotten to a point yet where we're taking into account the carbon emissions of all the things that we purchase. There has been some energy efficient new construction. So that LEED or environmental certification I was talking about earlier has been used from some of the new buildings on Mayo Clinic's campus. Unfortunately, getting LEED certified is a very expensive process. So Mayo has often said, hey, we'll do everything except for getting the formal certification. But one of the problems is that if you're not shooting for actually reaching that certification, it's easy to say, well, that next step is very expensive. Let's cut out this, right? Let's cut out that. And then you don't get near the efficiency levels that you would be ultimately shooting for. However, there has been more sort of environmentally minded construction. So one of our hospitals uses geothermal energy for heat, which is a very sustainable source of heat. And then we recently had an addition onto our psychiatric hospital that uses very modern architecture, but has a very low heating and cooling need. We've also decreased the amount of water use by 95 million gallons per year in our Rochester power plant, and they've used rain gardens to decrease runoff. So I'm not going to go into policy, the wonkiness of our particular system, but I would just say the overall impression is that there's a lot of like, you should do this, right? It's important to do this, but not a lot of concrete policy that says, this is what we need to do. This is our priority. This is how we need to cut back on these emissions. This is how we need to account for what we're doing, right? And that's really the next step here. And eventually has to be the next steps in all of healthcare to really understand our impact. So future goals, a couple of different things. We have electronic health records here, and there would be a possibility of saying, hey, can we give the environmental cost of some of these typical things that we do, right? If we order an X-ray versus an MRI, right? What's the carbon impact of that, of one procedure versus the other, if they give us a pretty clinically equivalent set of information? And so building that in, just like we sometimes are able to build into our electronic health record, the cost of different procedures and tests that we order. We also need to, like we said, increase how we're monitoring our sources of emissions and benchmarking and saying, here's our goals for reducing them. I think we need more ambitious and measurable goals for all three scopes of emissions, right? And we can only do that if we've successfully monitored and benchmarked what our sources of emissions are. We need energy efficient standards for building and for processes. And I think there's a much bigger capability to do renewable energy, solar carports, rooftop solar, geothermal energy, wind energy. The other thing that came out during the pandemic is we have a lot of employees that don't technically have to come to work, right? And so we saw that the emissions from employees commuting is a part of scope 3 emissions. And if they are able to work remotely, that can decrease the emissions from commuting, but also how much emissions come from our buildings in terms of heating, cooling, electricity generation, and the like. Minimizing single-use products, transitioning to a zero emission fleet. And then something I see a lot is making sure we're using water judiciously, right? Are we watering during like the night and the morning before the heat of the day and very sunny sort of times? And then having more employees involved, right? So it's one thing if there's a vocal minority that's talking about these issues, but as we get more employees to realize the importance of these impacts, then we can really start getting our institutions to change. All right, so thank you for surviving all of this, guys, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Rick, for that wonderful talk. Over to you, Dr. Verma. If you don't mind, can you just stop sharing your screen?
Yep.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Richard, for your enlightening presentation and on such an important topic, and a very critical topic, in fact, and more so on your choice to talk about the impact on the healthcare facilities and the things. I think that's something which is really an eye-opener for all of us. Especially for me, it was looking at the anesthetic gases. And so I know a lot of anesthetists around, so the kind of impact it has got. So it was very nice and enlightening thing, I think, and I appreciate your effort for that. Now, this linkage between environment and health is so complex. And I also like the thing about your lecture is I like the way you showed the systems, how the systems in UK and US are trying to implement to cut down these kind of the ill effects of environment. But the biggest problem, as you rightly said, is to actually track and understand the source, which is going to be the major problem for us, will be to track and understand the source, and also, have some amount of commitment. Okay. So if you say, if I would take an analogy in terms of, say, COVID, like even with COVID, people know, see, there is so much of COVID around the pandemic. They say they're talking about new waves coming in. The commitment that, people still continue to wear masks is being lost. If that commitment is there, there's some amount of thing you could reduce. It's not that it's 100% foolproof. The same comes with an emission too. The commitment of the organization, the commitment of the individual doctors, and as you rightly said, green advocates are a must. And I think you rightly put that in your future goals too. I think we should encourage more and more of green advocates coming in. And I personally believe that it's going to be more an multidisciplinary approach. You'll require all sorts of fields to come in to get this kind of a gamut of operations to do it. And in India, as we are trying, they are trying to bring out stringent rules now for the emissions from hospitals too, and then also bringing out these things. And like the Lancet countdown, the latest Lancet countdown rightly pointed, yes, there were positive things about say, lockdown, where the travel was less, people did not travel, the emissions were less. But that positive was overdone with so much of negative because of the waste generated, the disposables and the waste generated, and also even the sanitizers we used. That created so much of problem. See, that negative was there. So there must be a balance. I think we all should strive forward in trying to get a balance in this. My single question to you, one question if I may ask you is, what happens to healthcare costs with all this? No, I'm a practitioner. I'm just public health practitioner. So what will happen to healthcare costs? Will it skyrocket? So already we are finding it difficult to bear the expenses of healthcare. That's the biggest difficulty: health access, inequality in health. All these are because of the costs.
Yeah.
So what will happen to that?
And I think that's a problem that's dealt with in different ways all across the world, right? The inaffordability of healthcare is seemingly impacting all these different countries. Look at National Health Service right now is having some major difficulties, right? I can't speak to the solutions that will work for every location, right? But I can speak here, right? We are fortunate enough to live in a very wealthy country, right? And yet, even with the resources that a place like Mayo has, if something has a 7 or 10 year payback period, right, and then starts to generate profit after that, that's not good enough for them. They want 1 to 3 years, right? And when we think about that, that sort of short-term investment is probably not how most of these projects are going to be solved, right? How most of these things are going to be solved, right? And so, and when we think about this as internists or as physicians, right, we do a lot of preventative health to prevent something 10, 15, 20 years down the line, right? And so I really think that one of the problems is that, as at least in the United States, physicians are a little bit divorced from the business side of it, right? And what goes into the facilities that we use, our supply chains and that sort of thing, right? We just go and we try to take care of patients, order tests and the like, right? We don't necessarily get a lot of insight in terms of how much waste is this causing? What's the environmental impact of the decisions that we make? So as we've talked about, the importance of increasing advocacy, right? Because if we take more ownership and we realize that, yes, this does have a big impact on health, these decisions that we're making, maybe we're able to change the administration's priorities, right? To say, hey, make those longer term investments, even if that causes some costs now. Things like solar generate a net profit, at least in the United States, after 7 to 10 years, right? And they increase your resiliency, right? So my understanding is that India over the years has had a lot of problems with rolling brownouts, right? And so solar and potentially microgrids might even have a bigger financial impact in the long run there, right? If it had the right sort of capital structure and the like. You know, it's such a hard issue, because if there's already financial strain in a healthcare system, it's very hard to think ahead and say, hey, let's make that investment now, right? But we do that all the time when we build new facilities. Anytime we buy an MRI machine or a CT scanner, that sort of thing, we project out these costs in a payback period. And I think we really have to be looking at a lot of these projects both have a healthcare benefit in terms of emissions, right? But also can have a financial positive impact if we give it long enough.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
Thank you, Rick. Dr. Tumbanathan, would you like to say something, sir? So Rick, if I could just respond to some of the things that you said. There's been a lot of talk about moving from inhalational anesthetics to total intravenous anesthesia, but actually there is a huge environmental impact of that as well, because instead of air, it's the water and soil that's getting contaminated. And if you see the amount of plastic waste that is generated when total intravenous anesthesia is used, that you will find it mind-boggling. And the amount of drug that is wasted, because in inhalational anesthetic, the vaporizer is filled and you just use how much ever you want and the rest is there. But for intravenous, once you draw it, you got to throw whatever's left over. So, I mean, that aspect also, so perhaps definitely each one of us can contribute in whatever little way. And some of your slides mentioned that basically use lesser amount of gases, don't use desflurane, don't use nitrous oxide, all that is fine. And there is a resurgence of regional anesthesia, which actually kind of takes away has a huge environmental saving impact, because the amount of drugs used and the amount of consumables used are so less that, you'll have sorry for elaborating too much, because I'm an anesthetist, so I'm just, trying to put my my part of it. But I think in the end of the day, what Dr. Verma and you said is that each one of us should at least be aware and have it in mind that, can I do anything that will reduce the impact of, so rather than go to work in the morning, come back home for lunch and then go back again using my car, can I just go, sit there, or anything simple like that? Every small step counts, and I think we should address this to children in the schools, so that they are aware and they will be our future champions, and then it will impact every aspect. It's not just the healthcare. As doctors, we practice a profession for a certain number of hours, but the rest of the time we still live our life, and in everything we do has an environmental impact. So I think if we start thinking green, then automatically, irrespective of which profession you are in or what you do in your day job, you would still be doing the environmentally right thing. So that's just the 2 bits that I wanted to add. And
I think those are a really good 2 bits. I really think those are important, and I think it's about the next generation is already more active in advocating for this, right? And I think the other part of it is, as physicians, we're leaders, right? And so I think we have a role to be some of the most vocal voices here. I'll go back a second, right? When you make your point about anesthetic gases versus intravenous, right? The only way we're going to know which one contributes less in terms of emissions and climate change is if we do a full accounting, right? We have to know sort of how much plastic is generated, what's the life cycle of that versus using those anesthetic gases, right? And then is there ways that we can take either one of those, like you said, and decrease the amount of use and the amount of emissions that those generate. Right now, we're at the disadvantage we can't make good informed decisions because we can only sort of subjectively say, oh, it seems like we're throwing out a lot, right? But you're not going to be able to count the number of fluorine particles in the atmosphere, right? And so we really need to have a good way of grading these decisions and monitoring what our impact is.
I completely agree with you. If any of you have any questions or comments, please type it out in the chat box, or feel free to unmute yourself and speak. We are pretty informal here. Yes, Dr. Tumbanathan, I can see your hand is up.
Oh, this is a nice talk, really eye-opener that we are contributing towards the for the environmental disaster healthcare facilities, and the solutions are given quite nice. But India being a very poor country, or we cannot have that infrastructure, can you spend so much money in green energy when basic structures are lacking? Otherwise, we have to start somewhere. I think we'll do, but getting all the green energy initiative by the healthcare unit may be a bit difficult. It may take some more time. That's what my.
Yeah, but actually, solar energy is a very low-hanging fruit for us, because most of our country gets sunshine for extended periods of time, and we just don't have enough fossil fuel. And the cost of importing fossil fuel is huge. And I think our technology in solar energy is we have reached a very good level. So that is something that we could easily, that would be a low-hanging fruit that we could all adopt. Even older buildings can still have solar panels put in afterwards, or retrofitted, or whatever. So Rick, would you like to respond to what Dr. Tumanan said?
Yeah, and
I think that's okay. Yeah.
No, I'll just say that, I just don't know enough about what's going to work for your guys' health system, right? I would say that part of, and at the beginning I talked about, I did a month in Kathmandu in a public hospital there, right? And so there's a lot of patients in one room, right? There's not as much waste generated just because there's not as much, sterility in the same sort of way, and the single-use products are not the same. I think maybe the low-hanging fruit is, as that changes, right, as the healthcare system modernizes and evolves, right, do you build it out in a way that's environmentally sustainable, right? And that goes to your point, Vidya, do you incorporate solar, right? When you're building in your systems, is there a way to say, hey, how do we use less single-use products from the get-go, right? How do we sterilize and create recyclable streams and try to avoid things like we've done in our United States healthcare system, which is act like everything is disposable, right? We are not a great model. I enjoy practicing medicine, but I feel like there are a lot of things that we do in the United States that are wasteful, and it's a very broken healthcare system in its own right. And so part of it is, don't necessarily copy us, whole cloth, right? Do you have the ability, as we're doing this research and we're learning more about this, to take the good things that we do and not take other things, right? And form solutions that work for your guys' healthcare system that might not necessarily be what we're doing at all.
Yeah, Dr. Vasanthi has a comment. So she's also an anesthetist. She says regional anesthesia whenever possible. And every person must work towards this. I totally agree. India's Cochin airport is 100% solar powered. So we are getting there. We are getting there. And would you want to add a word on radiation health hazards, Rick? Because you probably didn't have time to cover it in your talk, but we have a few minutes now.
I think the radiation is, and I assume this means the radioactive waste that is generated, right?
I presume that. I presume.
Yeah. So radioactive waste is an important but small overall part of waste streams from hospitals. And I think that's not necessarily something that impacts climate change in the like, right? It does impact, are you storing that in a safe sort of way, right? And I think I don't know exactly how they do it elsewhere, right? I was very encouraged to learn that here at Mayo, we are actually neutralizing some of that radioactive waste and storing it on our own, which is kind of cool to learn.
So, Radhakrishna, I think you had some small interaction with Rick before we started. And normally Radhakrishna writes a long, kind of story introducing the topic or talking about what he thinks is going to be discussed during the talk on the Facebook page of Learning Indian Surgery. But today I think he was in a hurry, so he just said, log in at 8 o'clock to listen to Rick talk on environment. So, so Radhakrishna, what will be your tomorrow's write-up be?
No, I have written something else today about the number of MBBS and PG seats in India, and I was focusing completely on that. So and of course, this is a topic which is not frequently thought about. At least I feel in Indian circumstances, the havoc created by natural disasters is a lot more in India. In India, some part of the other floods are there, cyclones are there, and a lot of destruction. We don't really give a thought to what are the health hazards to it. But I think the more important aspect of Richard's presentation is the health hazard from the healthcare organizations themselves, which I never really thought of, because I think now on, maybe I had to remember each slide of yours. At every juncture, I think something can be done. I don't know who really looks into that. I don't think any of our doctor friends in my hospital look into that. I think there's somebody from who run the engineering side only look into it. But I'm sure the figures which you have given in Mayo Clinic and other hospitals in the US will no way match the ones in India. I think we all have to look into those aspects. I think they're quite interesting of waste disposal, of energy conservation, and also the way we deal with the anesthetic gases and other things in our operation theater. I think the lots needs to be done. It's a very, very special area, very interesting area. Actually, a lot of it is new to me. I'm sure that it's the same with everyone else, and I think it opened our eyes in a certain way, and I'm sure it'll have an impact on most of us, and we'll try to do justice to what you have spoken, Richard.
Thank you once again, Rick, for sparing time on a morning when you probably should normally would be working. Thank you for immediately accepting. I must thank Amit Ghosh for putting me in touch with you, and he would have loved to be here, but he's probably in flight on his way to India. So we hope to hear from you again sometime in the future. And I hope you enjoyed being with us as much as we enjoyed listening to you.
Thank you, guys. And thank you for giving me a chance to talk about this topic. It's something that really gets me motivated. So I hope that this motivates you guys. And yeah, happy to talk whenever in the future.
If you wanted to just tell reiterate 3 points from what you spoke today, what would they be?
Yeah, so 3 main things. Climate change, the health impacts of climate change is increasing, right? Both from major events and minor and everyday sort of events. We in healthcare have a big role to play in terms of creating this problem, and also how we work on decreasing our emissions in healthcare and mitigating the health impacts of climate change.
Thank you, Rick. We'll meet again next week with yet another episode of Marvelous Medicine. Till then, take care and stay safe. Good night.